What if Siri Tachi survived the Battle of Azure?
Ever wonder who you'd be if the Jedi hadn't taken you in?
Some days, I don't feel like a Jedi at all. Imagining alternate paths only takes one out of the moment. Jedi should always remain grounded in the present. I could never be anything else.
You're not like most Jedi. The Council would wag its finger at this conversation. Not that I care. Should probably get moving. Galaxy in peril and all that. Point is, I know what I'd be if I weren't a Jedi. And I'm never going back.
What would happen if the Jedi lover to Obiwan Kenobi never died during the Clone Wars? What if they continued to love without attachment? And what now? Having first met Obiwan Kenobi recently after his selection as a Padawan under Master Qui-Gon, she herself was still 2 years younger, yet still masterless, something that didn't stop her from openly calling Obi-Wan an embarrassment to all Padawans. With their bond itself only becoming solidified after exposing the connection of Brook Chun to Xanatos' infiltration of the Jedi Temple, and the accidental death of Brook from such a revelation taking years for Obi-Wan to move on from, the promotion for Siri to the position of Padawan would come narrowly a few months after such an incident, chosen by Adi Gallia, the selection of which also guaranteed the option to finally build her own violet lightsaber, straining and struggling to maintain her hostile facade from this point in George's timeline. Siri's own personality would slowly take inspiration from the very boy she kept close, especially during their fated mission to the planet of Sirius, and the isolation that their escape from such a planet swiftly wrought. Dispatched to save the boy, who would eventually grow into a code-breaking billionaire, Taliesin Fry, and faking their own deaths in an orbital crash to fool the bounty hunters that chased them, the prolonged nature of their mission and the time spent hiding in caves made romantic notions hard to hide. Bickering and complaining would snowball into confessions and feelings, the admittance of emotion where none was supposed to be. Going on to fully confess their love when they each thought their deaths were imminent, wishing nothing left to hide as they themselves thought they were going to crash. Only after their confessions to Master Yoda and Qui-Gon following such an event did each of these budding Jedi vow to formally abandon their love, a decision that would become more and more difficult with each day, especially after Siri essentially faked her fall to the dark side with the Jedi Council's permission, of course. And this is because when Obi-Wan himself went on to confront Siri about such a betrayal, he could sense the good in her, the honesty, sensations that spoke true to her heart and purpose, promptly becoming a Jedi Knight after her successful return. Skipping past the heroic actions Obi-Wan and Anakin undertook to save the hundreds of threatened senators held hostage amongst the Grand Senate Hall itself, as well as the Padawan she would take up, and his eventual resignation from the Jedi Order, I would be a bad host if I failed to mention my own inconsistencies about Siri Tachi's death in past videos, with the new essential chronology placing her death around 19 to 20 BBY, roughly the last year, maybe a few months before the last year of the Clone Wars itself, while 7 years later in our real timeline, the essential Reader's Companion dated it around 22 BBY, the first year of the Clone Wars. Normally, I wouldn't even acknowledge the later material, since the vast majority of my Star Wars knowledge is solely relegated towards the original Star Wars that George Lucas created. However, in my personal opinion, I humbly believe the essential Reader's Companion is a better fit into his original story. And the reason why her death happening in 22 BBY fits so much better in terms of the timeline is because of the dozens upon dozens of comics and novels covering the Clone Wars, as well as the TV show. If Siri Tachi did genuinely live until 19 BBY, like originally alluded to, she would be, and should be, much more prevalent throughout the 3-year war. An appearance that would become just as apparent now in our timeline, where, during the Battle of Azure, instead of leaping from her starfighter early to confront mages, she would remain alongside Padme Amidala, no longer managing to crash Magus' ship as he fled, but instead watching it be blasted apart once he attempted to bypass the Republic blockade in orbit. The resounding victory from such an outcome would essentially be the same as in George's timeline, except for the obvious difference, of course, the arrival of Siri Tachi back at Coruscant and her entrance into the hallowed halls of the Jedi Temple for another time, leading to our next major change. What exact month would she return into? I will not hide that this question itself can only be answered with headcanon, especially when taken into account the previous novels I've just mentioned. And in order to show as much respect as possible to the original authors that wrote these novels, I will be placing her survival date here. Roughly 1 month into the monstrously sized audiobook, The Cestus Deception, such a continued existence would mean happiness for the man that sought her, frequently teased by his Padawan, Anakin Skywalker. And while Siri would go on to change quite a lot, the mission to Asturis, alongside both missions to Metalorn, would proceed as normal. So too would the mission to Diadu, the riot at Mbardi Prison, and the Battle of Kartau, with the final confrontation of the Cestus Deception novel occurring the exact same too, since Siri wouldn't be performing the mission alongside Obi-Wan, with herself always being kept busy flying from sector to sector, parsec to parsec, and planet to planet. Something ever so often for Jedi during the Clone Wars. All until, quite possibly, the biggest change I've ever made in a story, the Battle of Jabeam. In George's timeline, it was the single-handedly most deadliest battle fought throughout the entire galactic Clone War, and something that Siri too would soon find herself swiftly rerouted towards, not because the Chancellor thought her place was with Obiwan Kenobi, but more because of the machinations that such a battle entailed. The first major battle amongst the second tier of the war itself, and in George's timeline, the place where Anakin briefly lost his master. So too would such drama rock the Chosen One in our story, except now his grief is shared nearly 10 times doubled by his nearest companion, Siri Tachi, there and present amongst the battlefield like so many other Jedi. Yet while the addition of her presence would give Anakin a solid foundation to rely upon, it wouldn't single-handedly change the war itself, since Jabeam wasn't just fought by mindless droids versus clones, but farmers, menders, and families standing up in rebellion against the tyranny of the Republic. Also, since she herself was at this point already a Jedi Master, the argument must be made that the command of the battle would fall to her after Obi-Wan's disappearance. But so too was her conviction even stronger than that of Anakin, sensing Obi-Wan when he was still alive, because their bond was unspoken. Such persistence would eventually infect and persuade the Padawans she fought alongside, gifting hope where none originally was, swelling into anger when, like in George's timeline, Chancellor Palpatine would pull Anakin from the siege during its final days. With the loss of countless Jedi, and arguably the trust of the native population, only a handful were left behind as more important evacuations were needed elsewhere, leading Siri to request and plead to remain, gracefully allowed by the Chancellor that met her, for his own backhanded reasons. And while it might at first appear to be the exact same as in George's timeline, what would be different is the capture of Obiwan Kenobi by Asajj Ventress. Since while he was originally thought dead, Siri's determination in our timeline would eventually pay off. Discovering her injured ally amongst the ruins of a charred and broken AT-AT, too late in the day to notice the precise time, yet knowing all too well how long the siege had lasted, 39 days straight, all of them drenched and pouring with rain. From here, still narrowly close to Cobalt Station, but unwilling to commit to such an already ruined position, Obi-Wan's cradled body became their new focal point, not just for Siri herself, but each and all of the surviving Padawan Pack members. A pack that, much like in George's timeline, would slowly become whittled down and slain as days continued to slowly drag by, minute by minute, hour by hour, and all of which was heavily polluted by the sounds of blaster fire. Narrowly surviving the next few days, paid for with the fresh blood from dozens of dead and now decayed clone corpses, the 40th day of the planetary siege would finally break Padawan K, as well as Jedi Padawan Elora Sun. On the 41st day, with the final remnants of the walled AT-AT, they hid inside, becoming fully blasted back and blown open. Nothing was now left to save them from the rain, sporadically mixed alongside the ever-bearing pattern of Confederate machinery rocketing off blaster rounds. Only then would Window Nin give his own life in whatever attempt could be made, paying the ultimate price to buy what little time he could. So too would Zuli Hiss die the very next day, just like she did in George's timeline. With the heroic last stands of Padawan Kaz and Lotor proceeding the same, and Vives's suit become breached just like it did, our next major change would be here, during the 44th night of the siege, directly after Aubrey gave her life to kill Alto Stratus. And that change would be the numbered droids that continued to surround the now last living survivors, Obiwan Kenobi and Siri Tachi, with the latter herself having devoted nearly every hour from the past half-week caring for the man beside her. There and then, swarmed and swallowed, wounded and without hope, alone and far from Republic space, Siri tossed her lit lightsaber. If she ran away now, there might be a chance to still survive. At least, that's what Obi-Wan was telling her. The calm acceptance of what the Force itself willed to be. There was no death. Each of these wounded Jedi then found themselves thinking shared memories from the past, back during their times on Sirius, and longing to do that which they vowed not, a vow broken as yet another barrage of blaster fire surged towards them from overhead. Fingers then spun to curl as hands interlocked while parched and pecked lips were raised and pressed together, revealing that the love they hid was never truly gone, and even now, when faced with annihilation, it refused to fade. Not the love born from possessive passion, the desire to control, or even the allure of lust that always leads to the dark side, but love for the sake of love, without fear of loss or the curse of attachment, not devoid of emotion, yet embracing it. And that's why neither of these Jedi Masters moved to budge or turn, to wince or retreat as their embrace turned to solid stone. Too busy to notice the sun finally breaching overhead and the arrival of the 45th day. Only the shielded deflection from a Republic transport above was able to break their trance, trailed by its opening entry bell and the ignition of Anakin Skywalker's lightsaber. Having successfully evacuated the Mesa as ordered, yet refusing to leave now, not because he wanted to play the hero, but because he finally sensed that which Siri Tachi had been telling him for the past week, the fact that his master, Obiwan Kenobi, was indeed alive, and through the Force, calling for help. Help that finally came with the forceful leap of Obi-Wan's Padawan, bridging the divide between them while slicing every blaster bolt that sought to kill. Because this boy born a slave wasn't just chosen by the boss, he also had friends in high places, managing to then save and extract both his own master and the injured companion kept close to him. The following loss on Jabim would be a major victory for the Confederacy. In fact, it would become a major turning point in the war. Going on to visit the hospital world, New Holstis, 2 days later, just as they did in George's timeline, the survival of not just Anakin himself, but both the wounded Jedi he escorted would be our next major change. A change that would surely leave Jedi Master Het and his Padawan, Bahat Jul, in a brief state of shock, thinking all 3 of them were dead. Of course, once news of their redeployment came in, and after Anakin's inscribed words upon the Jedi Monument, Obiwan Kenobi and Siri Tachi both would be given orders from the Council themselves to sit tight and rest. But not Anakin Skywalker, or the brand new duo of Jedi that now, just like in George's timeline, would head to reinforce the Battle of Argonar. With the events of the Republic 59 comic proceeding exactly as normal, since it's my favorite Star Wars comic and there is no way to improve it, from here, I can't talk about the Republic 60 comic until I address Alpha 17, a clone right up there with Captain Fordo himself. In George's timeline, both Alpha 17 and Obi-Wan are taken captive as prisoners by Ventress after the Battle of Jabim. And to be frank, without Obi-Wan Kenobi there to essentially break them both out of jail, Alpha would never escape. While I could invent some half-handed idea to have him break free by himself, join up with the Jedi, and have a happy ending, I personally think such a cheap outcome, while normal to fanfiction, is disrespectful and lazy to people that like following along. That's why I believe here, in our timeline, while Alpha 17 wouldn't break under torture or reveal any classified Republic information, he would eventually be outright slain and slaughtered by a frustrated Ventress, with her temper prone to flaring. However, it would go without stating that since there is no breakout, and Obi-Wan Kenobi himself wouldn't be there, none in the Republic would be able to witness, listen, or watch the detailed explanation of Ventress's past. In fact, with the events of the Republic 60 comic changed entirely in our story, her hold over the entire planet of Ratatak would remain secure. Dare I say, she would even be able to grow stronger without such a large challenge to her rule or the emotional loss it presented. Our next change, to the absolute delight of Supreme Chancellor Palpatine, albeit with a side of disdain for Obi-Wan's actual survival, would be this panel, where he addresses the Galactic Senate very shortly after the battles of Jabim and Argonar. What I mean is, Jedi Master Ki-Adi-Mundi wouldn't be present in our timeline, since Obi-Wan Kenobi's fated survival is already revealed, meaning Anakin Skywalker would be the sole standing Jedi in the presence of millions to take credit for what little success there was. Too true to Palpatine's character, and making it well known that the only good aspects from these battles came from the young man beside him, cried echoes and cheerful screams rebounded back in an erupting chorus. And while Palpatine wouldn't be able to use the implied death of Anakin's master to drive a wedge between him and the Council, the events of the Republic 61 comic, as well as the acts voted into Senate law, would be all he really desired. This would be the galaxy that not just Obi-Wan Kenobi and his Padawan would face, but so too would Siri Tachi, now by his side, briefly confessing their love for a second time to Yoda, and offering to leave the Order if such emotions weren't allowed. The idea wasn't even heard without being dismissed, as the Republic itself, and the Jedi Order charged to protect it, was already nearly crumbling. Too far gone with too many Jedi slain and dozens upon hundreds of planets in hostile hands. The Jedi Order, now more than ever, was desperate for any and every member they could get, already made apparent by Jabeam itself, where so few Jedi Masters could be spared that a whole pack of Padawans were sent in their place. And the names of each of these Padawan would go on to haunt Anakin, despite all the success he accomplished, because every death, every loss, every failure could be laid to blame on him, on his own lack of power, too weak to save anyone, just like he was too weak to save his mother.